hardly ever use after 10 years, 20 years. You know, okay, so I'll finish up by kind of stating that things like the police training, if it even was the police, I myself have doubts because there's kind of a fog of mystery around it, as evidenced by, you know, kind of past comments, that we don't really know, like, was this the state police? Well, if it was, or even if it's the Albany PD, why didn't they use the state police training barracks in Latham? Why did they have to use the neighborhood? What this does is it basically does the opposite of community policing. It's making enemies where we could be making friends. A simpler thing, it wouldn't even need civilian oversight. The police could simply just include communities in their training, do role-playing, hold workshops, have educational seminars, you know, instead of saying, well, ignorance is no excuse for breaking the law. Well, how about we make sure no one's ignorant of the law? Have classes, have open events at the library, like many other kinds of events at the library. Include in the local civics classes, you know, in Albany High, in civics, I'm taught the branches of government, but I'm not taught how to file a FOIA request, or how do I represent myself in court, or how do I properly speak to the police. I don't think that's done enough, if at all.
Mr. Platt, your time is up.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tim Carney.
Good evening. My name's Tim Carney. I live at 277 Delaware Avenue, Albany, New York. Today must be April Fool's Day because I agree with Marlon Anderson and Vincent Raguzzo on the same night. Marlon's great on a couple of things in which he had stated that the city has a poor way of communicating with city residents. Even with its website and some of the things that it does out there, if you go on to the city's website, it doesn't even list the different meetings and stuff on the calendar of events that they do have. There is I believe there is a television studio that supposedly is working and playing different things, but that seems to be hit and miss at best. And I agree with Vincent Raguzzo in regards to what we're doing as far as our polling places for city residents to vote on our school budgets. However, the reason I'm here this evening was to let the council know and also work with the council in regards to the Veterans Day Parade. For years, we've had the Veterans Day Parade start up on Central Avenue, march down, and finish up here at Lafayette Park. I had been speaking with a lot of veterans, and I had been speaking with the VA hospital, in which what we're trying to do is, at least for 1 year, try to have the Veterans Day Parade up on Delaware Avenue. Now, what we're trying to do is put together the main Veterans Day Parade, start it in the vicinity of the Sheehy Palmer Post, and have it come down Delaware Avenue, or I should say it would be north on Delaware Avenue, turn onto Holland, and finish up going into the VA hospital. Now, the VA hospital would love to have all the celebration there. They would want the politicians to come in and visit all the veterans. The way they said it, there's probably more veterans at the VA hospital than what, quite frankly, shows up at the Veterans Day Parade. But we'd like to have a celebration. We'd like to have a celebration on Delaware Avenue after the almost $20 million of renovations that Delaware Avenue went through. The residents up there, from who I've talked with, would love to see that and have people come over there and enjoy the neighborhood. The businesses that I've spoken with would love to be able to show off their businesses and showcase it at least for one day. Now, everybody I've spoken with so far has been in favor of it. This year, Veterans Day actually falls on Veterans Day, November 11th, 2013. The parade would start at approximately 11 o'clock. The way we're looking at the logistics would be, it would start at the intersection of 2nd Avenue, Delaware, and Whitehall, and everyone would be able to get together either from that area there up into the Sheehy Palmer Post, or have it go up Whitehall Road so it could gather at the School 23 and run up and down Hackett Boulevard for people to start and finish. So if there was busing, that people could park their cars over at the VA hospital, run down Hackett Boulevard, and they would be dropped off at the beginning of the parade over at School 23. Logistically, it can work. We believe that if the neighborhood, wants it, we're willing to try to do anything for it. The new chairman of the parade is Jim Ader, who is the head of the Sheehy Palmer Post. He's in favor of it. Peter Potter and the VA administration's in favor. I spoke to Sue Cleary, City Special Events, and I've spoken to the mayor in regards to it. We don't think that there should be any logistical problems. I spoke with Councilman Bailey in regards to the parade, because currently it goes through his ward, and he said he would be gracious enough, as far as he could see, to move it for at least 1 year. But we would really, really appreciate having something over on Delaware Avenue, and we hope that the council would be in favor of this and be willing to work with the parade group and any suggestions that they may have. We're having a meeting. The Delaware Area Neighborhood Association is having a meeting next Thursday at 7 p.m. at the library, and I'm going to be bringing over all the information and all the details to this point, and if anybody has any suggestions, I would hope to hear from it then. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. That's our last speaker. Our public comment period is now closed. We'll now move to consideration of local laws. Mr. Conti.
Madam President, please hold the local laws on the agenda.
Thank you. Now move to reports of standing committees. Mr. Casolaro.
Thank you, Madam President. The Housing Community Development Committee met last Wednesday prior to caucus to discuss the resolution that we'll be voting on tonight for the giving the mayor the authority to submit the CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant budget to the federal government. It has to be passed. The budget has to be in by April 15th. We ought to discuss the way the funding is going to change this year. Instead of going through the local development corporation, it's going to have to, the community development agency, it's going to be going through the city. So there's going to be some changes that are going to have to be made about the counts and where the money is going to be designated. It's probably going to have to be a board of estimate and apportionment vote on accepting the grant money when it comes in and distributing it to where it goes. Some more details are going to have to be worked out. And I talked to Commissioner Yeverly today, and we'll probably have to have another housing committee meeting sometime between now and the beginning of the first week of May or so to go over those details. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Ad hoc committees? If not, we'll move on to the consideration of ordinances. Ordinance introduced, Ms. Golby. Isn't that hers? I'm sorry. I had your name down instead of Ms. Fahey's. I'm sorry. All right, make sure. Clerk, please read the title.
An ordinance authorizing and directing the grant of a permanent air easement to Albany Medical Center over a portion of the city right-of-way of Myrtle Ave in the city of Albany for the construction of a patient building.
Is that going to a committee? No? Thank you. Mr. Igo?
Madam President, I notice ordinance 334113 for introduction.
Clerk, please read the title.
An ordinance amending Chapter 363 vendors of the Code of the City of Albany in relation to the requirements for door-to-door vendors.
Mr. Conti?
Madam President, that's referred to the Law Committee. And Madam President, I offer ordinance 344113 for introduction.
Clerk, please read the title.
An ordinance amending Chapter 375 zoning of the Code of the City of Albany in relation to uses within C1 neighborhood commercial zoning districts.
And Madam President, that is referred to the Planning Committee.
Mr. Conti?
And Madam President, you please hold the remaining ordinances with the exceptions of Agenda Item 7, uh, 37, 38, and 46. President, I'd like to make a motion to discharge from the Finance Committee ordinance 212213, which is agenda item number 37, ordinance 223113, which is agenda item number 38, and ordinance 303113, which is agenda item number 46.
Need a second? All those in favor? Opposed? Thank you. So we move to number 7. Mr. Casolaro.
Thank you, Madam President. I notice ordinance 31.32.13 and ask for its passage and roll call vote thereon.
Clerk, please read the title.
An ordinance amending Article 11A, Gun Violence Prevention Implementation Team of Chapter 42, Departments and Commissions of the Code of the City of Albany.
Is there any discussion? If not, please call the roll.
Mr. Bailey? Mr. Casolaro? Mr. Camiso? Mr. Conti? Ms. Fahey? Mr. Freeman? Ms. Golby?
Yes.
Mr. Herring? Mr. Igo? Ms. Jenkins Cox? Mr. Konev?
Yes, co-sponsor.
Mr. O'Brien? Mr. Rosenzweig? Mr. Sano? Ms. Smith? 15 in the affirmative.
Ordinance passes. Mr. Sano?
Thank you, Madam President. I notice ordinance 212213 and move for its passage and a roll call vote thereon.
Clerk, please read the title.
It's 21, 22, right?
Yes.
An ordinance authorizing certain projects by the City of New York at a maximum estimated cost of $200,000 and authorizing the issuance of $200,000 serial bonds of said city to pay the cost thereof for computer software.
Is there any he skipped over Albany, but
Oh, sorry.
went to New York.
I guess that was my April Fool's.
Is there any other discussion? Mr. Casolaro?
Thank you, Madam President. I will be voting to support this ordinance, but again, I just want to point out that 6-7 months ago, when we were doing the budget, when this came up, it was mentioned that, we were going to hold off until we have our IT position filled. It's been about almost a year and a half now, and the position still hasn't been filled. It was part of the mayor's State of the City address and part of his budget proposal back in 2011. It is now April of 2013, and we still don't have anybody in this position. It's desperately needed. We have systems that still don't talk to each other among the departments. Now we're bonding for hundreds of thousands of dollars of software, and we still don't have a point person in place to oversee this. I don't know what takes so long. My son graduated within this time with a degree in computer networking before he even hired anybody. So I think, we really need to get moving again. Maybe we need to nudge the mayor again, remind him of his promises and of his keynotes of his speeches he gives, that this position needs to be here. We're still operating on systems that are, 20 years old now, that you can't fix, that you can't replace parts, that you can't upgrade anymore. As was pointed out earlier in public comment period, they can't even have communications on the systems. So I'm going to vote for this, even though I have a little bit of hesitation, since we don't have a point person in place to oversee the software, making sure that it's compatible with the police department, general services, and everyone else that needs it. Thank you.
Anyone else? Not, please call the roll.
Mr. Bailey? Mr. Casolaro? Mr. Camiso? Mr. Conti? Ms. Fahey? Mr. Freeman? Ms. Golby?
Yes.
Mr. Herring? Mr. Igo? Ms. Jenkins Cox? Mr. Konev?
Yes, co-sponsor.
Mr. O'Brien? Mr. Rosenzweig? Mr. Sano? And Ms. Smith? 15 in the affirmative.
Ordinance passes. Mr. Sano?
Madam President, I notice ordinance 223113 and move for its passage and a roll call vote thereon.
Clerk, please read the title.
An ordinance authorizing certain projects by the city of Albany, New York at a maximum estimated cost of $240,000 and authorizing the issuance of $240,000 serial bonds of said city to pay the cost thereof for defibrillators.
Is there any discussion? Not, please call the roll.
Mr. Bailey? Mr. Casolaro? Mr. Camiso? Mr. Conti? Ms. Fahey? Mr. Freeman? Ms. Golby?
Yes.
Mr. Herring? Mr. Igo? Ms. Jenkins Cox? Mr. Konev?
Yes.
Mr. O'Brien? Mr. Rosenzweig? Mr. Sano? Ms. Smith? 15 in the affirmative.
The ordinance passes. Okay. Now move to resolutions.
One more.
I'm sorry. I thought we were done. With number 46? 46, yeah. Mr. Sano?
Thank you. Madam President, I notice ordinance 303113 and move for its passage and a roll call vote thereon.
Clerk, please read the title.
An ordinance authorizing certain projects by the city of Albany, New York at a maximum estimated cost of $100,000 and authorizing the issuance of $100,000 serial bonds of said city to pay the cost thereof, resurfacing of recreation courts.
Is there any discussion? Not, please call the roll.
Mr. Bailey? Mr. Casolaro? Mr. Camiso? Mr. Conti? Ms. Fahey? Mr. Freeman? Ms. Golby?
Yes.
Mr. Herring? Mr. Igo? Ms. Jenkins Cox? Mr. Konev?
Yes, co-sponsor.
Mr. O'Brien? Mr. Rosenzweig? Mr. Sano? Ms. Smith? 15 in the affirmative.
The ordinance passes. Now move to resolutions introduced. Mr. Casolaro.
Madam President, I notice resolution 18.41.13R for introduction, passage, and a roll call vote thereon.
Clerk, please read the title.
Resolution designating the mayor to act as official representative of the city of Albany to submit annually to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development the annual action plan and amendments thereto under the Community Development Block Grant Program.
Are we voting on this, or is it just? Yes. Okay. Is there any discussion? If not, please call the roll.
Mr. Bailey? Mr. Casolaro? Mr. Camiso? Mr. Conti? Ms. Fahey? Mr. Freeman? Ms. Golby?
Yes, co-sponsor, please.
Mr. Herring? Mr. Igo? Ms. Jenkins Cox? Mr. Konev?
Yes, co-sponsor, please.
Mr. O'Brien? Mr. Rosenzweig? Mr. Sano? Ms. Smith? 15 in the affirmative.
Resolution passes. Ms. Smith?
Thank you, Madam President. I notice Resolution 19.41.13R for introduction.
Clerk, please read the title.
Resolution in support of the New York State Women's Equality Agenda.
Mr. Konya. Can someone do that on behalf?
Madam President, I move to introduce Resolution 2041-13 and ask for a roll call over on.
Is that an introduction or a roll call vote? Okay, thank you. Clerk, please read the title.
Resolution of the Common Council supporting the City of Albany in its award from the New York State Environmental Facilities Corporation for funding under the Green Initiative Grants Program.
Is there any discussion? Not, please call the roll.
Mr. Bailey? Mr. Casolaro? Mr. Camiso? Mr. Conti? Ms. Fahey? Mr. Freeman? Ms. Golby?
Yes, co-sponsor, please.
Mr. Herring? Mr. Igo? Ms. Jenkins Cox? Mr. Konev? Mr. O'Brien? Mr. Rosenzweig? Mr. Sano? Ms. Smith? 15 in the affirmative.
Resolution passes. Mr. Conti?
Madam President, I request majority consent to add the following resolutions to tonight's agenda: 2141-13R, 2241-13R, 2341-13R.
All those in favor? Opposed? Thank you. Mr. Sano?
Thank you, Madam President. I notice Resolution 2141-13 and move for its passage and roll call vote thereon.
Clerk, please read the title.
A resolution opposing the end of Saturday USPS mail delivery and urging Congress to enact legislation to mandate that the service be continued and to enact the Postal Service Protection Act of 2013.
Is there any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bailey? Mr. Casolaro? Mr. Camiso? Mr. Conti? Ms. Fahey? Mr. Freeman? Ms. Golby?
Yes.
Mr. Herring? Mr. Igo? Ms. Jenkins Cox? Mr. Konev?
Yes.
Mr. O'Brien? Mr. Rosenzweig? Mr. Sano? Ms. Smith? 15 in the affirmative.
Resolution passes. Mr. Camiso? Clerk, please read the title.
Resolution urging the City of Albany School Board to ensure convenient access to and consistency of polling places for voters.
Madam President, I noticed Resolution 234113. Read in its entirety, please.
Clerk, please read it, the title and the resolution. These mics are kind of weird, so if you could.
Adjust it. A resolution honoring the late Leonard Morgan Besser for his contributions in the fight to eliminate gun violence in the city of Albany. Whereas Dr. Leonard Morgan Besser had a long and distinguished professional career in the criminal justice field. However, he will be remembered within government and law enforcement circles for his unwavering mission to find ways to curb the scourge of gun violence in the city of Albany and around the country. Dr. Morgan Besser believed and taught others that gun violence was a public health crisis, not just as a criminal justice problem, opening up solutions that were previously not thought of and discovering allies and institutions not previously involved. And whereas he kept a meticulous list of every gun crime perpetrated in the city. And a resident of the Buckingham Pond neighborhood, he spent his free time painstakingly cataloging the violence on Albany's streets, plumbing the depth of newspaper reports as well as television newscasts for even passing mentions of a shooting or armed robbery not on his list. Whereas he was the spark that ignited the drive to create a gun violence task force in Albany, where he served for several years. Since the task force was established and its recommendation put in place by the city, the number of gun-related homicides in the city has decreased significantly. One of the recommendations of the task force advocated by the Dr. Morgan Besser was for the city to follow the ceasefire model out of Chicago. The city did act on the recommendation, and the SNUG program was implemented with the state grant that helped establish a Chicago ceasefire program in Albany, and where Dr. Morgan Besser worked for the New York State Department of Correctional Services Central Office since 1975. As well as teaching at the College of St. Rose and the Empire State College, much of his professional focus involved improving the working environment and mental health of corrections officers, creating programs to assist crime victims, and researching the treatment of sex offenders. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the City of Albany Common Council pauses in its deliberations to recognize the contributions of a remarkable advocate, Leonard Morgan Besser, and mourns the passing of this energetic and committed resident who cared deeply for the entire city.
Is there any discussion? Mr.
Madam President, this resolution touches on a little bit of Leonard's life. He was quite a guy. I got to know over the last 20 years, and I definitely miss him. I drive by his house the last few months, and I see this storage pot out there, and I kept saying, geez, I wonder if to be able to get everything, just his papers in one of them. He had papers for everything, as we know. This touched on his professional life and his private life. He was a man that lived his faith. He lived what he believed. He was just a great guy. He would do everything to help anybody he could. He was I would like to call him one of the founders of the Buckingham Pond Neighborhood Association. He helped start that, get it off its feet. Whatever was up in the neighborhood, Leonard became involved in. He could find wetlands where nobody thought wetlands could exist to keep something from going where it probably didn't really belong. But I missed his emails. A rabbi said to me one night, he says, how do you keep up with all of Leonard's emails? And I said, it's really not possible. But if you don't, you're going to get a phone call in the middle of the night or in the middle of the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning. So I tried to keep up with him. He was so well-intended, and he was, a lot of people, he was a different guy, but he did everything with class, whether he dissented on a report, if the gun violence task force came out, if he did it in a nice way, a professional way, and it's just the way he was. He's a good guy, and I miss him, and in a lot of ways, we'll miss him and we won't miss him here. You know what I'm saying? God bless you, Leonard, and I hope tonight that we adjourn out of his memory. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Smith?
I certainly can reinforce what Councilmember Igo said about what a wonderful person and a unique person Dr. Morgan Besser was. One of the things that I think many people did know about him is how devout he was in his Jewish faith, and he would remind us when we scheduled by mistake meetings that we should have been more conscious of. He also embodied that faith from what I could see because he was so committed to justice